So, what if the exact religious texts that are, currently being used to justify this seemingly endless forever war, what if they actually contain the literal step-by-step legal blueprint for peace?
Right. It sounds impossible when you first hear it.
It really does. I mean, if you open up your phone right now, you are just hit with this absolute wall of noise about the Jewish-Muslim conflict. And it's almost entirely framed as this ancient, intractable blood feud.
Yeah, exactly. Like a clash of civilizations that's existed since the dawn of time.
Right, and completely immune to modern diplomacy. But today, for you, the listener who really wants to cut through all that noise, we are doing a deep dive into an analysis that argues we actually have this completely backward. The theology isn't the cause of the fire.
No, it's the fire extinguisher.
Exactly. The fire extinguisher we are actively refusing to use.
It's a really profound paradigm shift. When you look at the architecture of the argument we're analyzing today, it moves the lens entirely away from religious fatalism. Instead, it frames the violence as a distinctly modern political problem.
Which is a huge distinction.
Huge. It's an incredibly complex political problem, yes, but one that already has the theological tools required for a durable resolution, just sitting right there in the historical record.
Okay, before we really get into the mechanics of how that works, I do want to share a crucial disclaimer with you, the listener. The materials we are unpacking today contain, frankly, deeply charged political and historical subject matter.
Very charged.
Yeah. So we are not endorsing any viewpoints, and we are absolutely not taking any sides today. Our mission here is purely analytical. We're just unpacking the concepts, the history, and the arguments presented in our source material so you can understand the specific, fascinating perspective on a global crisis.
Yeah, the goal is just to provide a framework for understanding,
Yeah.
Not to tell anyone what to think. We're just mapping out the author's logics.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with how we diagnose the problem itself, because a lot of people treat this conflict like a single, solid monolith, like a wall they keep running into.
Yeah, but the analysis suggests we're actually collapsing three entirely different conflicts into one giant unsolvable mess. It's not a monolith. It's more like a three-layered cake.
A three-layered cake. I like that analogy.
Yeah, or a three-dimensional chessboard.
Okay.
Because if you pull a geopolitical string, you immediately tighten a theological knot. You can't slice them with the same knife.
So walk us through those three layers.
Okay, first you have the geopolitical layer. This is fundamentally about tangible, earthly resources. It's a dispute over borders, water rights, state sovereignty, displacement, and military power.
The mechanics of who controls what territory.
Exactly. Then intertwined with that is the theological tension, and this deals with the metaphysical realm. So competing claims about prophecy, who holds the covenant with the divine, and of course the sacred geography of Jerusalem.
Right, which is incredibly potent. And then there's a third layer, which I think feels incredibly relevant to how people argue about this online.
The civilizational friction. Yes, these are two distinct cultures that historically share Semitic roots, an Abrahamic lineage, and a really profound reverence for Mosaic law.
They have so much in common structurally.
They really do. Yet, over the last century of conflict, they've largely constructed their modern identities in opposition to each other. They've defined themselves by who they are not.
So the core mistake the international community makes is treating these three layers as one homogeneous problem.
Right. Because you cannot solve a geopolitical dispute over water rights by arguing about 7th century theology.
Yeah.
And you definitely can't resolve a civilizational identity crisis with a military treaty.
Okay, I want to pull on that theological string for a second, because to me that feels like the most intractable part. Like, if two groups fundamentally believe God gave them the exact same piece of land, that's just a zero-sum game, right?
Well, that's what we assume.
Yeah.
But the biggest revelation in this material is that theology is actually the most solvable layer.
Wait, really?
Yes. The blueprint for coexistence is already written into the traditions.
That is mind-blowing. Okay, give us the specific evidence for that. Let's look at the Islamic tradition first, because there is this very pervasive modern narrative that Islam inherently requires the subjugation or even destruction of Judaism.
Right. But the source material demonstrates that this is just not structurally true. The Quran explicitly designates Jews and Christians as Al al-Kitab, the people of the book.
Ah, Al-Kitab, okay.
Yeah, and this is a formal theological recognition of them as holders of prior legitimate divine revelation.
Okay, I hear that, but I have to push back a little here. A listener looking at current events or reading the rhetoric of modern extremist groups online is going to say, look, that's a nice ancient concept, but it's absolutely not what I see on the news.
Sure, and that's a fair point. But how do we reconcile that? By looking at the actual legal mechanics of early Islamic statecraft,
Hmm.
rather than just listening to modern political rhetoric. The material points us directly to the Constitution of Medina, which was established by the Prophet Muhammad. Yeah. And this wasn't just some vague spiritual idea. It was a binding political and legal document.
And what did it actually do?
Under this constitution, Jewish tribes were integrated into the Ummah, the community. They were granted legal autonomy, the absolute right to practice their religion freely, and they even had a mutual defense pact with the Muslims.
Wow. So it was a functional, pluralistic society by design, not by accident.
Exactly.
But what about the concept of dhimmi? Because when that word gets thrown around today, it's almost always associated with, like, second-class citizenship or systemic oppression.
Yeah, and the analysis does acknowledge that history. Over centuries, the concept of dhimmi was eventually corrupted by various empires into a system of structural subordination.
Right.
But we have to look at its original mechanism. Originally, it was a legal framework specifically designed for protected coexistence. It was essentially a social contract. Well, non-Muslims paid a specific tax in exchange for exemption from military service and the absolute protection of the Islamic State. The theology itself was architected to accommodate difference.
Okay, so if that is the Islamic blueprint, let's slip over and look at the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
Because the material argues that Judaism is equally equipped for pluralism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A really defining feature of Jewish theology is that it lacks a mandate for universal conversion.
Meaning they aren't trying to make everyone else Jewish.
Exactly. There is no theological imperative to make the whole world Jewish. Instead, you have the framework of the Noahide laws.
Oh, right. Explain how that works practically, because it's an incredibly nuanced concept.
So the Noahide laws are essentially a universal moral code. Things like prohibitions against murder, theft, idolatry, and so on.
Just basic ethical baseline stuff.
Right. And the Jewish legal tradition holds that any non-Jew who abides by these foundational ethical laws is considered righteous. They have a legitimate covenantal relationship with the divine. They don't need to convert to Judaism.
So the theology explicitly creates space for the other to exist fully and legitimately in the eyes of God.
Exactly. And the material also brings up Maimonides, who is a fascinating historical figure to look at in this context.
Yeah, Maimonides, he's huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
Maimonides, or the Rambam, is arguably one of the most influential Torah scholars in history. He lived in the 12th century during the Islamic Golden Age. He actually wrote his philosophical masterpiece, The Guide for the Perplexed, in Judeo-Arabic.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, he was deeply immersed in Islamic philosophy. And legally, within Jewish thought, Maimonides explicitly categorized Islam as a genuine, strict monotheism.
So he essentially codified into Jewish law that Muslims are worshiping the exact same God.
Yes, and beyond just legal categorization, the broader prophetic tradition within Judaism envisions a future of shalom.
Which usually just gets translated as peace.
Right, but we often mistranslate shalom as simply a lack of conflict or like a uniform monoculture where everyone just assimilates into one thing.
Oh, interesting. So what does it actually mean?
In the prophetic vision, it means distinct, different nations living side by side in harmony, maintaining their unique identities without threatening each other.
Okay, so synthesizing all this, the religious justification for coexistence isn't some new age concept that, diplomats in Geneva need to invent from scratch.
Not at all.
The legal and theological blueprints have been sitting there for over a millennium. The Constitution of Medina, the Noahide laws. But, this immediately raises a glaring question. If the instructions for peace are right there in the texts, why is the building on fire? How do people just ignore them?
Well, because theology doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates inside human psychology.
Right.
And this is where the analysis shifts from ancient texts to modern reality, focusing heavily on the concept of institutionalized trauma. Because, as the author points out, nuance doesn't win elections, it doesn't fundraise, and it doesn't go viral.
That makes total sense. We know that on a neurological level, nuance just does not survive an existential threat. When people are terrified, identity hardens. It's just so much easier to organize a political movement around fear and anger than it is around complex pluralistic theology.
Exactly. And we have to ground that fear because it is not abstract. The material points to the two foundational traumas of the modern era that have fundamentally wired the psychology of both populations.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, the Holocaust. The analysis argues that the Holocaust produced a Jewish people and subsequently an Israeli statecraft, where an existential threat is not considered paranoia. It is a lived historical memory.
Right. The imperative of security overrides everything else because the absolute worst case scenario isn't some theoretical exercise. It actually happened.
It happened. And on the other side, the analysis points to the Nakba.
And just to provide the historical context for the listener here, the Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe, refers to the mass displacement and dispossession of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War.
Yes. And the material explains that the Nakba produced a Palestinian people for whom dispossession is not a metaphor. Nor is it just a past historical event. It is experienced as an ongoing structural reality. It's the loss of civilizational continuity.
Now, the author is incredibly careful with how this is framed, and I think we need to be clear about it, too.
Yeah.
Recognizing these parallel wounds is not about establishing a moral equivalence, right? It's not a competition of suffering.
No, that is a vital distinction. What's fascinating here is the author's stance. The analysis isn't weighing the traumas on a scale to see who suffered more. It is stating a functional reality. Both traumas are deeply real to the people who hold them, and crucially, both are currently being weaponized by different political actors to justify ongoing violence.
Which brings us to an analogy I found incredibly striking in the material. We have these two deeply traumatized populations essentially trapped inside a burning house, fighting over the last breath of air.
Right.
But there are outsiders standing at the windows, continuously tossing in matches, and they are doing it because they literally own the match company.
Yes. It perfectly captures the geopolitical reality. Trauma provides the emotional fuel, but the material insists we have to follow the power and the money to understand why the fire never burns out.
So it's not just the people inside the house.
No, the conflict persists in large part because it is incredibly useful to external empires.
Okay, we need to name those empires. Starting historically, the material specifically points to the Balfour Declaration.
Right. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 is highlighted as a primary structural wedge. This was the moment the British Empire, a Western colonial power, formally promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, largely without consulting the Arab population already living there.
Wow.
The author describes this as the living wound. It was an imperial maneuver driven by British strategic interests during World War I, but the mechanics of it guaranteed that any peaceful resolution would be structurally improbable from day one.
They essentially set the board for a zero-sum game.
They did.
But it's not just a critique of early 20th century British colonialism, is it? The analysis pulls absolutely no punches regarding modern global powers either.
Oh, not at all. It points directly at the United States, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the broader Western arms economy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the expert states that naming these external powers isn't a conspiracy theory. The author calls it basic political literacy.
So break down how that actually works. How do these external powers practically profit from the instability?
Well, it functions through proxy influence and economics. For external empires, having a foothold in the Middle East is strategically vital for global hegemony. The region becomes a chessboard where superpowers test their geopolitical strength without directly going to war with each other.
Right, proxy wars.
Exactly. And furthermore, the global arms economy structurally relies on perpetual tension. Arms dealers need a market.
It's a business.
It is. And politically, demagogues on all sides find it incredibly useful to keep their populations terrified of an external other. Fearful populations don't ask questions about domestic corruption or economic failure. They just rally behind the strong man who promises them security.
So we have a deeply, deeply layered diagnosis here. We have geopolitical disputes intertwined with weaponized theology. We have institutionalized trauma overriding the actual peaceful tenets of the religions. And we have a global conflict economy constantly tossing in matches.
It's a bleak picture.
It is really bleak. But importantly, the material doesn't stop at diagnosis. It pivots to a very specific roadmap for how to actually untangle the knot.
Yes, it outlines 5 simultaneous movements for a durable resolution. And the key word there is simultaneous. The argument is that you cannot implement one of these and ignore the others. They have to operate together to change the structural reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's work our way through these 5 steps. The first movement deals directly with how we handle the psychological fuel we were just talking about. Witness, don't weaponize.
Right. This is asking for a profound shift in empathy. It means Jewish historical trauma, including the millennia of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, must be fully witnessed and acknowledged by the global community.
Validated.
Validated, yes. However, that trauma cannot be used as a moral justification for the present dispossession of Palestinians.
Right.
And simultaneously, Palestinian trauma, the displacement, the military occupation, the generational poverty must be fully witnessed and acknowledged. But it cannot be used to justify anti-Semitism or the targeting of civilians.
It's basically asking people to hold 2 truths at once, right? Refusing to let suffering become a license for violence.
Exactly.
Okay, the second movement involves the religious leaders, reclaiming religious authority.
Remember we discussed the Constitution of Medina and the Noahide laws.
Yeah.
Well, the analysis argues that the ulema, the body of Islamic scholars, and the rabbinate, the recognized Jewish religious authorities, must actively reclaim these frameworks. Currently, the most extreme, violent interpretations of the texts are the ones rewarded with attention and political power.
Because they go viral.
Right. So the institutions themselves have to loudly amplify their own traditions of hospitality and shared stewardship.
Which leads us to the third movement, and I think this one fundamentally flips how we usually talk about peace treaties. It's about prioritizing dignity over structure. Because when you watch the news, the entire debate is structural, right? Is it a 2-state solution? A 1-state democratic reality? A confederacy?
Yeah, and the material argues that obsessing over the final political structure is putting the cart before the horse. The political form is entirely secondary. What is primary and what must be non-negotiable from the start is human dignity.
Period.
Period. The premise has to be that every single person living between the river and the sea has the fundamental right to live without being bombed, without being arbitrarily caged, without being displaced, and without being erased.
So the political structures have to be designed to catch up to the baseline of human dignity rather than trying to fit human beings into a rigid geopolitical structure that denies them their basic rights.
Precisely. Which brings us to the fourth movement, which addresses who actually gets to negotiate that structure.
Okay, I have to push back on this fourth movement on behalf of the listener, because the movement is called Decenter the Diaspora. And for someone listening right now in New York or London or Paris who feels a profound existential connection to this conflict, either as a Jewish person or a Muslim person being told to step back and decenter themselves, is a really hard pill to swallow. They feel like they have a massive stake in this.
I know, it is a harsh truth. But the analysis frames it as a structural necessity. The reality is that diaspora communities, particularly in the United States, have a massively outsized influence on the political discourse, the lobbying, and the funding surrounding this conflict. Yet, neither group fully lives inside the physical reality of it.
The loudest voices are insulated from the actual physical danger.
That is the core issue. The resolution cannot be dictated by Twitter arguments in Brooklyn or political lobbying in London. The people who must lead the resolution are the people whose children are actually sitting in the rubble or running to the bomb shelters.
Right.
The diaspora can offer support and resources,
Right.
but they cannot drive the vehicle because they do not have to live with the daily consequences of the compromises required for peace.
You have to have actual skin in the game to negotiate the terms.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the final movement, which ties back to our match company metaphor from earlier. Name the empire.
You have to shut down the conflict economy. As we discussed, no grassroots peace movement, no matter how profound, will ever hold as long as external superpowers are allowed to continuously inject weapons and proxy funds into the region to serve their own geopolitical interests. The matches have to be cut off.
So what does this all mean? We have these 5 intertwined movements. Refusing to weaponize trauma, reclaiming pluralistic theology, establishing human dignity before drawing borders, letting the people on the ground lead, and cutting off the imperial profiteers. If we somehow pull all of that off, what does the resolution actually look like? Because the material makes it clear that it isn't some naive utopian fantasy.
No, it provides a very grounded synthesis. Resolution does not mean everyone suddenly agrees on the historical narrative.
Right.
It doesn't mean ideological differences evaporate. It certainly doesn't mean one side achieves total victory and just defeats the other's narrative.
It's not a Disney movie ending where everyone hugs.
No. It is simply two peoples both of whom have miraculously survived attempted historical erasure, looking at each other, acknowledging that reality, and making a conscious structural choice to stop enacting erasure on one another.
Wow. It is the unviral, painfully slow work of returning to the theology they both already possess. Like you said, the Islamic tradition reviving the political imagination of the Constitution of Medina, and the Jewish tradition actualizing the prophetic vision of shalom, distinct nations living securely side by side.
That's the overarching takeaway. The blueprint exists. The question is whether the populations, and more importantly, the people currently holding power, will choose the theology of coexistence over the profitability of violence.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. As you go about your week, try to think beyond the Middle East. Think about the ideological battles in your own life, the enemies you are told you must constantly fight. How much of what we believe about our own modern opponents is actually rooted in our deepest traditions and values? And how much of it is just a convenient narrative, a wall of fire handed to us by someone who was quietly profiting off our fear?